Welcome to our channel. We are glad to see you here, where we share amazing stories from people's lives. Each of you is important to us, and we would be interested to know what country and city you are from. Please write about it in the comments. And now let's move on to our first story. Emily woke up early in the morning, with the first rays of sunlight softly filtering through the translucent curtains of her bedroom. Her home was always quiet and cozy, a two-story building with a well-kept garden, typical of suburbs where everyone knows everyone and life flows smoothly. She went down to the kitchen to make coffee and spend a quiet morning while her husband and son were still asleep. In the silence, the sounds of the coffee maker seemed almost meditative. Emily's family life seemed perfect. Her husband, John, worked for a local company, and she was a stay-at-home mom who had spent the last few years raising their 5-year-old son, Lucas. They enjoyed walks in the neighborhood park, morning trips to the grocery store, and visits with neighbors. Everything was predictable and calm, just the way Emily had always dreamed. However, despite all the outward stability, Emily had moments when she felt like the world was not as safe as she would like. She was used to feeling safe in her suburban neighborhood, where everything was familiar and ordinary, but every time something or someone appeared that was outside her everyday sense of the norm, Emily began to feel a certain discomfort. She rarely discussed these feelings, even with John, but deep down, certain fears troubled her. Sometimes she found herself staring at strangers, especially if they were not from her usual circle. It seemed like casual curiosity, but she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that arose from time to time. Her inner voice, sometimes harsh and judgmental, nudged her to be careful. Maybe it was because she was constantly reading news about crimes or seeing reports about suspicious people. All of this subtly affected her perception of the world. Today was not going to be anything special. Emily was going to go to the park with Lucas, as usual, but somewhere deep inside her, there was already a feeling that this day would change her life forever. Emily put her mug down on the table and looked out the window, lost in thought. The yard was empty, except for a light breeze rustling the tree branches and the morning birds singing their usual songs. She had always loved this morning calm. For her, the suburbs symbolized safety, clean streets, friendly neighbors, familiar faces at the supermarket. But sometimes she felt that this idyll could be disturbed by something unknown and alien. Over the past few years, she had noticed that there were new families moving into the neighborhood, and not all of them looked like the one she was used to. Emily didn't consider herself prejudiced, but it was hard not to notice the twitch inside her whenever she was around people who weren't like her or her neighbors. It was subtle, like echoes of something distant she'd absorbed as a child, but it was always there in the background. Her thoughts were interrupted by the quiet footsteps of Lucas, who sleepily walked down the stairs with a crumpled toy under his arm. Emily smiled, hugged her son and offered him breakfast. The day began, as always, with caring for the family, classes, games and a walk in the park. She could not know that this ordinary trip with a child would become the beginning of events that would make her reconsider many things. Later, when they were at the park, Emily sat on a bench and watched Lucas run around the playground. Other children were laughing and playing nearby. Their parents were talking quietly to each other. Everything seemed normal, but something new caught her attention: a black man who came with a little boy. He seemed friendly and was just playing with his son, but Emily couldn't shake off a strange feeling of unease. Her inner voice, which usually quietly observed everything that was happening, suddenly became louder. She tried to calm herself by reminding herself that this was just a father and child, just like everyone else, but something inside her was pushing her to think that she needed to be more careful. She had heard stories about how you always need to be on guard, and this obsessive inner fear began to gain strength. Emily pretended to be busy with her phone, but continued to watch the man out of the corner of her eye. Her anxiety was growing with each passing minute, although there was no real reason for it. He was just playing with a boy, like all the other parents around him. But her mind, accustomed to the standards of their small world, did not give her peace. She looked back at Lucas, who was happily running around with the other children. It's okay, she tried to reassure herself, but something was nagging at her. Emily sat on a bench and continued to look at the strange man. His son, about the same age as Lucas, was laughing happily as he slid down the slide. Mark, that was the man's name, was helping the boy get up and jump back onto the playground. It all looked completely innocent, but Emily couldn't shake off the growing feeling of anxiety. It was a strange feeling that she couldn't explain logically. She tried to focus on her phone. checking her messages and the weather, but her thoughts kept returning to the man. Her heart beat a little faster, and a voice inside her began to doubt. Why is he here? He doesn't look like our neighbors. Is this boy really his son? These thoughts were quick and barely conscious, like flashes on the edge of consciousness. Emily knew that such questions were not something she should worry about, and yet, something in her pushed her to these doubts. She thought of the news stories that kept flashing on TV, stories of crime, suspicious people, dangers you wouldn't expect in your own neighborhood. These images seemed intertwined with her own fears. Maybe that was what was making her react so strongly. There was a real battle going on inside her between her mind, which told her nothing was wrong, and those deep fears she couldn't quite control. What if he's up to something? Another thought flashed through Emily's mind, and she felt her palms begin to sweat. She tried not to panic, but the worry was already firmly lodged inside her. She had never encountered a situation like this in her neighborhood. Everything was familiar and predictable. The people she saw every day looked like her family, and this man, something about him made her feel unjustifiably uneasy. The internal dialogue grew louder. He's just playing with his son. Stop. But what if it's not his son? There's no reason to think that. You're just winding yourself up. I have to do something, just in case. Emily glanced around, checking to see if anyone else had noticed the man. Everyone seemed relaxed. Parents were talking to each other. Children were running around the playground. No one except her seemed the least bit worried. It made her a little uneasy, but it didn't calm her down. Her gaze fell again on Mark, who seemed to be paying no attention to her at all. He was completely absorbed in playing with the boy, but it was precisely this lack of suspicion on the part of the man that made Emily feel like she had to be on guard. The fear within her, although irrational, was taking hold of her mind more and more. Maybe I should just call the police and have them check. I don't have to act on my own. Better safe than sorry. This thought, which flashed through her head for the first time, gradually became obsessive. Emily looked back at her son, who was playing with his friends on the playground. She couldn't let anything happen to him. What if he or another child was attacked? These thoughts were already haunting her. Although logic told her that she was exaggerating, the fear was stronger. She clutched the phone tighter in her hands and began dialing the police. Just to check, she reassured herself, not realizing that her actions could lead to consequences she hadn't even suspected. Emily took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. Her fingers began to shake nervously as she pressed the call button. The sounds of playful laughter around her seemed distant and out of place, as if they were happening in another world where she was not in any danger. In that moment, she felt like she was the only one who saw the threat lurking behind Mark's innocent smile. When the dispatcher answered, Emily began to speak, but her voice sounded hesitant. Hello, I'm at the park, and there's a man who seems to be acting strange. He has a child, and I'm just worried about my son's safety. At that moment, Emily didn't realize how her words might sound to the person on the other end of the line. She felt like her concerns were overblown, but inside, there was a fear that wouldn't go away. The dispatcher politely asked a few questions about the man's location and appearance. Emily, struggling to concentrate, described Mark, focusing on his skin color, which in itself was an indicator of bias. She knew it was wrong, but she couldn't stop herself. Her anxiety was forcing her to act against her own better judgment. After she ended the call, Emily felt a wave of confusion and shame wash over her. She couldn't believe she'd done it. I just wanted to protect my son. She tried to justify herself to herself, but the seeds of doubt were already growing in her mind. The neighboring parents were giving her puzzled looks when they noticed her watching Mark closely. She felt uneasy, as if her actions had made her look bad. As Emily sat on the bench, her eyes met Mark's again. He seemed unaware of her worries and continued playing with the boy, who was laughing and enjoying himself. This picture reminded her of how Lucas also loved to play carefree, and her heart was filled with conflicting feelings. On the one hand, she was afraid, but on the other, she realized that her fears seemed completely unfounded. A few minutes later, a police car pulled up to the park, and Emily's heart began to pound even harder. She felt a wave of shame wash over her. The police officers got out and began to survey the area. Heading in her direction, Emily tried to gather her thoughts and explain the situation to them. She knew that her actions could cause serious consequences for Mark, and that was what worried her the most. As one of the police officers approached her, Emily quickly began to explain. I saw him and I just had a bad feeling. I don't know what else to say. She felt her words losing their meaning, and fear was growing inside her. The officer nodded politely, continuing to listen to her. and she suddenly realized that because of her unfounded suspicions, someone's life could possibly be ruined. At this point, Mark noticed the police officers approaching him. His expression changed, and Emily couldn't help but notice the surprise and confusion that crossed his face. He looked at his son and then at the police officers, and her heart sank with the feeling that she had caused this confrontation. Mark instantly became wary when he noticed the police officers. His face, which had been beaming with joy while playing with his son, suddenly darkened. Emily could see him quickly switch from a relaxed parent to someone who realized that the situation could get out of control. She felt a lump form in her chest, regret and fear filling her heart at the same time. The police officer approached Mark and began asking questions. Emily listened to their conversation, and with each word her shame only increased. "Are you okay?" the police officer asked, to which Mark responded with bewilderment. "Yeah, I'm just playing with my son." The policeman then turned to Emily, who was still sitting on the bench. She knew she had something important to say, but the words were stuck in her throat. She knew that at that moment her fear and prejudice were becoming a real threat to Mark, who had done nothing to deserve her suspicions. I was just worried about my son's safety," she said, her voice shaking. The policeman nodded, and Mark seemed increasingly confused. Emily noticed him take his son's hand, and the gesture seemed alarming to her. She couldn't help but notice his confidence beginning to fade. The policeman, observing the reactions of both, asked Mark a few clarifying questions about his son, asking where he lived and what his name was. Mark answered clearly, but there were notes of irritation and concern in his voice. Emily felt her own uncertainty begin to turn into guilt. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she told the officer. "I just saw him and I just got a bad feeling. I know it's wrong, but you did the right thing by raising your concerns," the policeman said, but his tone was stern. "However, we must understand that this may be very difficult for the person you are addressing." Emily looked at Mark and his son, who were now standing together, and her heart sank with shame. She couldn't help but think about how her actions might have caused them to fear and mistrust. She felt like something had changed in her understanding of the world, in her perception of safety. As the officers began to say goodbye to Mark, Emily finally gathered her courage and stepped closer. "I'm so sorry," she said, speaking sincerely to him. "I had no right to act like that. I let fear and prejudice override common sense." Mark, who had looked at her with confusion at first, nodded slowly. His face remained tense, but she saw something else in his eyes, a faint understanding. "I'm just playing with my son, like everyone else. No need to worry," he said, his voice calm, but with a hint of anger and disappointment. Emily felt like her words couldn't take back what had already happened. She watched Mark hug his son, and the moment seemed infinitely sad. She knew that her action could hurt not only him, but the entire small community they were both a part of. At that moment, she realized that her actions would have consequences. Emily realized that this was not just a chance meeting, this was a turning point that would force her to rethink her beliefs and attitudes towards others. However, at that moment, when she felt guilty and remorseful, Mark simply turned his back on her and walked deeper into the park with his son, leaving Emily with heavy thoughts and uncertainty about the future. As Mark and his son disappeared from view, Emily stood there, overcome with conflicting emotions. She knew that her actions could have negative consequences for an innocent person, and this feeling tormented her inside. However, deep down, she continued to convince herself that she had done the right thing by calling the police. "I was just protecting my son," she whispered to herself, and that was the only thing that gave her any confidence. Emily had always seen herself as a caring mother, willing to do anything to keep her child safe. In her mind, protecting her family was her first responsibility, and that was her logic. "I couldn't just sit back and watch," she kept repeating like a mantra. Still sitting on the bench, Emily glanced out at the playground where her son was laughing and playing with the other children. The sound was familiar and close to her, a reminder of what she had worked so hard for, but deep down, she still felt anxious. What if something happens? What if I don't call and it gets dangerous? Emily felt her inner conflict growing. On the one hand, she knew she shouldn't have reacted so strongly. On the other, her maternal instincts demanded action. Her fears, based on news headlines and stereotypes she might not have recognized, seemed well-founded. She was a victim of her own upbringing, surrounded by multiple ideas about what safety looked like. At that moment, as Emily was thinking about what she could have done differently, her phone rang again. It was her friend Lisa, who usually called to discuss the news or just to chat. Emily decided that talking to her might distract her and help her collect her thoughts. "Hi Emily, how are you? How was your day?" Lisa asked, and her cheerful voice made Emily smile. She tried to sound more confident, but her inner turmoil did not leave her. "It's okay," she said, trying to sound casual, "just walking in the park with Lucas," but inside, all the same worries were starting to flare up again. Lisa, noticing the tension in her friend's voice, continued, "Is something wrong? You sound a little tense." Emily, unsure whether she should open up, finally took the plunge and told him what had happened to Mark. She explained how she had felt scared when she saw him and his son, and how she had ended up calling the police. Lisa fell silent, and Emily could hear her friend processing the information. "I understand that you wanted to protect Lucas, but perhaps it was unnecessary," Lisa noted carefully. "You know that many people are just living their lives and are not a threat." Emily felt the shame wash over her again, but she tried to hold on. "I know, I just couldn't shake it. I always thought my main job was to protect my son, but you shouldn't let your fears control you. Maybe you should talk to him if you see him again," Lisa suggested, and Emily felt like it might be a good idea, but how could she approach Mark after what had happened? She had already betrayed him, and that guilt was still there. "Yeah, maybe," she finally agreed, though she didn't believe it. As the conversation continued, Emily became increasingly aware of how her fears and biases were shaping her perception of the world around her. She realized that simply calling the police wasn't enough to deal with her inner demons. At the end of the conversation, Emily thanked Lisa for her support, but she felt that this was only the beginning of her journey to awareness. No matter how hard she tried to convince herself that she had done the right thing, an inner voice still reproached her for weakness and stereotypes. She could not get rid of the thought that her fears could harm not only herself, but also other people she might meet in the future. When Emily came back to reality, her attention was drawn back to Lucas, who was happily playing with the other children. She looked at him and thought about how important it was to learn to distinguish real threats from her own fears. In that moment, she knew that she had to be strong and wise not only for herself, but for her son as well. Emily stared at Lucas for a long time, who was happily riding the slide, laughing and bursting into joy. This moment, full of carefree childhood, became a small oasis of calm for her in the raging storm of her thoughts. But soon this idyll was broken. Emily felt something inside her snap, a reminder that she needed to deal with the consequences of her decision. "I have to meet Mark," she finally decided. The thought of going up to him and apologizing began to fill her with hope. It seemed like the only right thing she could do, but how could she do that after calling the police herself? The question gnawed at her mind, and Emily knew she couldn't leave it to chance. She stood up and headed towards the park exit, taking a few deep breaths to gather her thoughts. Emily knew she had to act and that the best way to right her wrong was to confront the man she had wrongly suspected. She decided she would wait for the right moment to see Mark again. "I just have to wait," Emily told herself. Sometime later, when she decided she couldn't stay in the park any longer, Emily called her husband to tell him what had happened. "John, you won't believe what happened," she began, excitement in her voice. "I called the police on a stranger who was playing with Lucas in the park." John seemed shocked. "What? Why did you do that?" he asked, and Emily felt the shame wash over her again. "I don't know, I saw him and I had a bad feeling," she admitted, feeling like her words couldn't justify the act. "But he's innocent, he was just playing with the kid." John sighed. "I understand that you were worried about safety, but we need to learn to trust people. We can't live in fear." Emily knew he was right. She didn't want fear to control her actions. "I understand, John, and I feel terrible. I have to talk to him and explain that I was wrong," she said with determination. After her conversation with her husband, Emily felt a new desire arise within her, the desire to learn and change. She knew that the path ahead would be difficult, but the inner voice that told her to correct her mistakes became more and more insistent. The next day, when Emily came to the park again with Lucas, she was full of determination. She walked around the area, looking at people, and in her heart there was a hope that she would be able to find Mark. She imagined how she would go up to him and, having gathered her strength, tell him that she was very sorry. She understood that this was the only way to restore justice and, perhaps, change something in her life. However, every time she saw a man with a child, she was overcome with confusion. Emily tried to calm herself, but fear rose to the surface again and again. Just when she began to feel ready, her confidence would fade, and her inner critic would begin to erode her resolve again. Finally, when Emily was beginning to lose hope, she saw Mark come to the park again. Her heart started beating faster when she saw him playing with his son, laughing and enjoying the simple moments. This was her chance. With all her strength, Emily took a step forward. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she had to do it. It wasn't just for her, it was for Mark, who probably never knew the fear and misunderstanding she had created that day. As she got closer, she felt her mouth go dry. Emily took a deep breath and said, "Mark." He turned around and his expression changed, clearly surprised to see her. Emily came closer, her voice shaking but determined. "I need to talk to you." Mark stopped and looked at Emily carefully, his expression a mixture of surprise and confusion. You could see in his eyes how he was assessing her intentions. Emily felt doubt creeping up inside her, but she couldn't back down. I want to apologize," she said, feeling her voice shake. "I made a mistake calling the police. I let my fears get the better of me and didn't give you a chance to show who you really are." She saw his face relax slightly, but Mark was still wary. "You couldn't have known," he said, but there was no judgment in his voice, just mild confusion. "I was just in the park with my son. I didn't do anything wrong." "I know," she replied, her heart clenching with regret. "I shouldn't have reacted the way I did. I allowed myself to believe in stereotypes and my own fears." Mark was silent, and a tense silence hung in the air. Emily suddenly felt that these words were not just an apology, they were an internal confession, her desire to be a better person. She realized that this conversation was important not only for her, but for him, too. "I want you to know that I am not like that. I want to learn and change. I am so sorry that my actions may have hurt you," she continued, feeling her emotions welling up inside her. "I don't want fear and mistrust to define our society." Mark, having listened to her, finally relaxed. His expression became more open, and he seemed to begin to understand that Emily was sincere in her words. "I appreciate you coming and talking to me," he said, and there was gratitude in his voice. Not everyone could do that. Emily felt a weight lift from her soul. She knew it wouldn't solve everything, but it was a start. This step was important, and maybe it would change something in their relationship and how they saw each other. "Thank you for understanding," she replied, her voice sincere. "I hope I can change my preconceived notions and become a better mother and community member." "We all make mistakes," Mark said with a slight smile. "It's important that we learn from our mistakes." This time, when they exchanged glances, there was no tension in the air. Instead, Emily felt a connection between them, an opportunity for a new beginning, based on understanding and respect. "If you don't mind, maybe we could play with the kids together," Emily suggested, trying to take a step toward real friendship. "I would be glad to," Mark replied, his face lighting up with a kind smile. Together they walked to the playground where their children were happily playing. Emily knew that this moment was only the beginning of her journey to change. There were challenges ahead, but now, with this new hope, she felt she could handle them. This meeting was a turning point in her life, a moment when fear gave way to understanding and decision. Emily was ready to change her life, and perhaps even the lives of others, starting with this one step. Emily and Mark had just shared their first smiles when suddenly a siren sounded. She turned around to see a patrol car pulling up to the park. Her heart began to beat faster as she was once again plagued by thoughts of what she had done wrong. She couldn't believe the police were back, and this was not what she had dreamed of. "Mark," she whispered, looking at him anxiously. His face had gone pale, and she could see his courage beginning to wane. "What if this is all because of me?" But before he could answer, the police officers got out of the car, and one of them immediately walked towards Mark. Emily felt her stomach clench with fear when she noticed that Mark was already preparing for a confrontation. "What's going on here?" asked the policeman, his expression full of stern seriousness. "I'm just playing with my son," Mark said, his voice shaking but with a hint of desperation. "I didn't do anything wrong." Another officer, a little tougher, came closer. "We received a call that you were acting suspiciously," he said, not hiding the hostility in his voice. "What do you have to say for yourself?" Mark, feeling humiliated, gritted his teeth. "I'm here with my son. We were just playing on the playground. Is this a crime?" "You could explain it if there hadn't been a call," the policeman retorted. Emily watched, her heart sinking at the realization that she had caused this unnecessary situation. The tension was growing with each passing second. Mark took his son's hand, and Emily noticed how scared he was. His small face looked confused and upset. "Daddy, why are they here?" the child asked, looking at his father with the hope that he could protect him. Emily felt her conscience begin to gnaw at her from the inside. "I need to tell them I was wrong," she thought, but fear kept her from saying the words out loud. "You must understand that such calls do not go without consequences," the policeman continued, his tone stern and unyielding. "We must make sure that there is nothing suspicious in your behavior." Mark, suppressing his anger, stepped closer to the policeman. "You have no right to address me like that. I'm not a criminal. I'm just a father playing with his son. I don't deserve to be treated like that." Emily, feeling the situation was getting out of control, finally made up her mind. "Wait!" she shouted, her voice loud and unexpected. All eyes turned to her, and she realized she had to explain herself. I called the police," she said, her voice shaking as she moved closer to Mark and the officers. "I saw him and I got scared, and it was wrong. I shouldn't have done that." Mark turned to her, confused and angry. "What are you doing?" he asked, looking at her as if he was trying to figure out why she was interfering again. "I just want to make things right," she said, her voice quieter but more insistent. "I didn't think it would come to this. I was just wrong." The policemen exchanged glances and one of them said, "We need to find out what happened. If you have any explanation, it will help us understand the situation." Emily looked at Mark. His expression changed. There was shock and humiliation there that she couldn't ignore. "I'm sorry, Mark," she said, feeling tears welling up in her eyes. "I wanted to protect my son, but I shouldn't have reacted so strongly." "You could have just come up to me and talked," Mark said, his voice full of vulnerability. "I just wanted to spend time with my baby." The policeman, having listened attentively to their conversation, looked at Emily. "This is quite important. We appreciate your honesty," he said, "but, unfortunately, such actions can hurt people." Emily nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt the turmoil building inside her, and knew that the consequences of her actions might be deeper than she expected. "I understand," she said. "I just want things to go back to normal." Meanwhile, Mark, clearly dejected, looked at his son. "It's okay, baby. I'm with you," he said, trying to reassure him, but in his eyes Emily saw a reflection of anger and disappointment. The police officers finally began to put away their uniforms, realizing that the situation had gotten out of hand. "We're leaving, but please think about how important it is to understand and trust each other," one of them said before turning and walking away, leaving Emily and Mark with unsaid words and a tense atmosphere. Emily stood there, feeling completely helpless. She could see Mark pulling his son aside, and her heart was breaking with guilt. She knew this wasn't over. This incident had left a deep mark that would be hard to erase. Her mistakes weren't just mistakes, but lessons that she would have to learn. The chapter ended, but its lessons were just beginning. Emily realized that the biases and fears she faced would require much more work than she had ever imagined. Emily stood at the edge of the landing, her heart pounding in time with her thoughts of what had just happened. She watched Mark lead his son away, and even though they were no longer under the watchful eye of the police, the tension in the air was still there. "Mark," she called, her voice urgent but also sincere. "Please wait." He stopped but didn't turn around. The silence felt like a blow to Emily's heart. She knew his feelings for her now were far from positive. This wasn't just a situation, this was his life, and it had thrown him into chaos. "I have to explain this," she continued, trying to bridge the distance between them. "I didn't mean to, I just didn't know what to do. I let fear get the better of me." Finally, Mark turned around. His face was tense, and his eyes were filled with everything from shock to anger, humiliation to fear. "How could you do this?" he asked, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "I was with my child. It wasn't my fault." "I know," Emily replied, her voice softer but still worried. "I know it was wrong. I don't know how to explain it. I had preconceived notions, and I let them cloud my judgment." "Preconceived notions?" Mark said, his voice rising sharply. "You call that preconceived notions? I'm just a father who came to the park with his son, and you decided I was dangerous." Emily felt tears welling up in her eyes. She couldn't deny the truth of his words, and each one was like a knife piercing her heart. "I understand, and I can't change that," she said, her voice beginning to shake. "But I came here to tell you that I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you." There was a moment of silence between them. Emily saw Mark hesitate, his eyes warring between anger and a desire to understand. "You should have come to me and talked to me," he said finally, his voice quiet. "I would have explained." "I know," she said, her heart clenching in pain. "I just let fear cloud me. I don't know why it happened, but I hope I can fix it." Mark looked at his son, who was watching them with curiosity and a little fear. "What are you going to do now?" he asked, not hiding his displeasure. Emily took a deep breath, realizing that all she could do was try to right her wrongs. "I want to change my life," she replied. "I want to learn to trust people and overcome my fears, and I don't want this to become an obstacle between us." She came closer, her voice more determined. "I want to talk to you. I want to know your story. I want to understand what it's like to be a parent in our biased society." Mark hesitated, but Emily saw something more in his eyes, a spark of hope. "This may not be easy," he said, but there was no cruelty in his tone. "You have to be willing to hear the hard things." "I'm ready," she said confidently, feeling her inner fears begin to recede. "I'm ready to learn and change, and I want you to know that I'm not just a mother who protects her child. I'm a person who understands that we need to work on ourselves." Mark nodded silently, his heart seeming to open. "Okay, let's try, but I need time," he said, his voice no longer angered. Emily felt relieved, but she knew this was just the beginning. She knew the conversations would be difficult, and that she had a long journey of self-awareness ahead of her. At this time, her son Lucas, noticing that his mother and the new acquaintance were talking, approached them. "Mom, can we play together?" he asked, genuinely interested. Mark looked at him, his face softening again. "Of course, baby," he said with a smile, and Emily saw the disappointment and confusion begin to give way to understanding. "You too, Emily, if you're ready, we can play together," Mark said, and it was like a small step towards a new friendship. Taking a deep breath, Emily walked up to her son and said, "Yes, let's all play together." And though their paths had crossed in tragic ways, they were now standing on the threshold of something new. Emily felt her heart fill with hope. Maybe this really was a chance for change, and if they could open up to each other, it would be the beginning of their journey together toward understanding and trust. Emily stood at the edge of the playground, watching her son play with Mark's boy. Despite this, anxiety never left her. The scene seemed casual, but an internal debate was raging in her head. She knew she should be there to support Mark, but fear still smoldered in her soul. Suddenly one of the policemen came back, and his face was as serious as ever. He walked up to Emily and said, "Miss, we've been doing a little investigating." His voice was stern, and Emily felt her heart beat faster. "Is something wrong?" she asked, trying to control her emotions. "We have determined that this man," he pointed at Mark, "is the legal guardian of this child." The policeman looked at her with disdain, and her world began to crumble. "What?" Her voice trembled. "How is this possible? We checked his papers. He has all the necessary rights. He is not a criminal. He cares about his son," the policeman said, his words like a hammer, breaking the last barriers of her prejudice. Emily felt everything inside her crack at the seams. "But I saw," she began, but her voice broke. "What did you see?" the policeman interrupted, his tone becoming more insistent. "You saw a man playing with a child. That's not a crime. Your reaction was based on fears and stereotypes. Do you understand that?" She nodded slowly, trying to comprehend the magnitude of her mistakes. "I didn't think it was that serious," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "That's right, you didn't think, you just assumed," the policeman said, his expression firm. "And that's why we're here. Fears can kill, just like hate. They destroy lives." Emily felt warm tears roll down her cheeks. "I didn't mean to do anything bad," she said, her voice a crackling sound that broke the silence. "I just wanted to protect my baby." The policeman sighed, looking at her with some sympathy. "Protection should not come at the expense of others. You must understand that such actions can have devastating consequences." At this point, Mark came closer, his eyes sparkling with displeasure. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice full of anger. "Why are you crying, Emily?" I just realized what I did," she said, unable to hide her feelings. "I was wrong about you, Mark. I let my fears get the better of me, and I called the police." Mark frowned, his face reflecting pain and anger. "This isn't just a mistake, Emily. This is something that could change lives. I want you to understand that because of your actions, I could have lost everything." Her heart was breaking, but she knew it was true. I understand, she said, her voice hard. I want to fix this. I want to learn about you and your son. I want to understand what it's like to be a father in our society. It won't be easy, he said, looking at her with disbelief. You need to recognize your biases and how they can affect the lives of others. At this point, the policeman seemed to lose interest in the conflict. We're leaving, but keep in mind that situations like this may arise again, he said, heading toward the car. I hope you've learned your lesson. Once they were gone, Mark took a deep breath. Do you really think you can change your mind just like that? He asked, his voice sounding incredulous. I want to try, she said, determination creeping into her voice. I don't want to live in fear anymore. I want to understand people. I want to stop seeing only skin color. Emily's emotions were raging inside her, and she knew that her biases were deeper than she had thought. She also knew that while the road to understanding would be long and difficult, she was willing to take it. Let's start with the basics, Mark said, his voice calmer but still tense. I'm going to tell you about myself and what it means to be a black father in this society, but be prepared, it won't be easy. I'm ready, Emily said, her heart filling with determination. I'm ready to learn. Emily took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. What can you tell me that I don't know? She asked, trying to hide her vulnerability. Fear was building inside her, but so was a desire to learn. Mark looked at her, his face softening. When I was a young father, the world around me seemed unfriendly. I always knew I had to be doubly careful, not just for my son, but for myself, he said, his voice quieter. I often felt like my every move was being watched. Emily nodded, feeling her heart clench. But you didn't do anything wrong. You were just playing with the baby, she said, her voice shaking with understanding. Exactly, Mark replied, his eyes shining. But for many people, it doesn't matter. I remember one time, just walking with him in the park, when the police came up to us and asked what we were doing there. I just wanted to spend time with my son, but I could see the distrust in their eyes. It's awful, Emily whispered, realizing that her fears weren't just abstract, but real experiences for people like Mark. I never thought of it that way. That's the problem, he said, looking her straight in the eye. A lot of people like you live in a bubble, not realizing that fears and prejudices can ruin lives. I don't want my son to grow up with the same prejudices you do. He needs to know that it doesn't matter what color his skin is. Emily felt her own beliefs begin to shift. I want to help him, she said, her voice growing more confident. I want him to know that it's important to be a person, not just a member of a race. This is an important step, Mark said, and there was pride in his voice. You understand what trust is, but this is just the beginning. You will have to learn a lot to overcome your fears. Emily looked at him and nodded. I'm ready. I want to learn more about you, your experiences, and how I can be part of the solution, not the problem. It won't be easy, Mark said, but there was no longer any mistrust in his tone. But if you're sincere, I'm willing to share my story. It was at that moment that Emily realized that everything that had happened was not just a coincidence. It was a turning point that changed her perception. She felt an understanding begin to grow inside her that could become the basis for friendship and change. Let's get started, she said, her voice full of determination. Tell me how you became who you are, and how you cope with it every day. Mark thought for a moment, then smiled softly and began to talk about his childhood, how he had faced hardships, and how he became a father who wanted the best for his son. His story was full of passion and pain, and Emily realized that it was not just a memory, it was a reflection of his struggle to survive in a world that was sometimes cruel. With every word Mark spoke, Emily felt her own prejudices begin to dissipate. She couldn't believe how much they could learn from each other, and how their lives, seemingly so different, could be connected by their shared fears and hopes. By the end of their conversation, Emily realized she had taken a step toward transforming her thinking. She knew she had a lot of work ahead, but this was the beginning of her journey toward understanding and redemption. Thank you, Mark, she said, her voice full of sincerity. I know I hurt you, but I hope I can make it right. It's just the beginning, he replied with a smile that held warm hope. But I can see that you're ready to change, and that's the most important thing. A calm evening at Emily and Mark's home seemed to be covered by a fog of calm. They spent time discussing their lives and dreams for the future, and gradually a friendship began to blossom between them. But their idyll was soon shattered like lightning when a local who witnessed the incident posted a video on social media. That evening, Emily was sitting on the couch with Lucas when her phone vibrated. At first, she ignored it, continuing to tell her son the story, but when the notifications started coming in one after another, her curiosity got the better of her. She glanced at the screen and her heart stopped. The video of her and Mark in the park had already spread across the internet. The comments were like shrapnel, tearing at her confidence. How could she call the police on an innocent man? Another case of racial bias. Wrong stereotypes kill. Emily felt the blood drain from her face. Mark, she screamed, her voice like glass breaking. Look at this. She showed him the screen, and his face changed as if a storm of emotion had hit him. Mark read the comments, his fists clenched, his eyes flashing with anger. The woman who filmed this couldn't have known what really happened, he said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. She just wanted to cash in on the sensation. But it's not just a video, Emily replied, her voice growing fragile. It's destroying us. It's not just a funny situation. People don't understand how I really felt. Mark opened the video page and saw his face look scared and humiliated. This is not just a video. This is destroying my reputation. I want people to understand that I am not a threat, he said, his eyes full of pain. We have to do something, Emily said, her voice firm. We can't let this go on. It's not fair. What are you suggesting? Mark asked, his voice still angry. You think we can just refute it? People want sensationalism, and they won't listen to the truth. But Emily was already on a path where fear no longer ruled her thoughts. I know it's going to be hard, but we can reach out to reporters. We can tell our story and explain what really happened. This could only make things worse, Mark said, his voice a whisper, full of warning. Maybe we should just leave it alone? No, Emily said insistently. If we don't tell who we really are, this video will become the only truth for a lot of people. Mark looked at her, his face softening a little. Are you sure this is worth it? Are you ready to face the consequences? I can't sit here and watch this story destroy us, she said, determination in her eyes. This isn't just about us. This is about how society perceives people. We can change that. Meanwhile, the video continued to spread. News reports covered it as yet another case of racial bias. People shared it, commented on it, discussed it. Amid all the noise, Emily realized that she really needed to take action. The next day, she approached local news stations. We need to talk, she told the producer who interviewed her. I want to tell my story. It's important. Do you realize that this could cause even more controversy? The producer asked, looking at her certainty with interest. I understand, Emily replied, her voice full of confidence. But it's necessary. If we don't tell the story, how will people understand that bias isn't just a fear, but a real threat? As the video went viral, Emily and Mark began to feel the pressure from the public mount. They became the subject of discussions and their names made headlines. Emily realized that this situation was no longer just a personal incident. It was everyone's business. But once they decided to tell their story, something in their lives changed. Excitement and fear began to blur the boundaries of their previous expectations. It was the beginning of a battle not only for their names, but for the understanding they so desperately sought. Emily, are you ready for this? Mark asked, his voice filled with concern. I'm ready, she said, and in that moment Emily realized that this story would not only be theirs, but also a shared one, important for everyone who had experienced prejudice and misunderstanding. The tension grew with each passing minute. Emily and Mark knew they had a long and difficult road ahead of them, and their story could change public opinion about bias and racial stereotypes. They prepared their thoughts and arguments, preparing to share them with reporters. The next day, Emily and Mark met with the crew who would be filming their interview at a local TV studio. The cameras were already set up, and the lighting highlighted their faces, creating an air of importance for the moment. Emily looked at Mark, and in his eyes she saw support, but also concern. Are you ready? She asked quietly, feeling excitement wash over her. I don't know, he said, taking a deep breath, but we need to do it. We need to show people that bias isn't just a phrase, it's a real problem that's ruining lives. The camera started rolling and the interviewer turned to them, smiling. Thank you for coming. We were all shocked by what happened in the park. Can you tell us your version of events? Emily took a deep breath. I can't justify my actions. I called the police on a man who was playing with a child in a park. I acted out of fear and prejudice, and now I understand how that could have ruined someone else's life. Mark took the floor, his voice firm. I was shocked when I found out she called the police. I had no idea that playing with my son could cause such a reaction. I want people to understand that our fears are not just thoughts. They can be destructive actions. The interviewer nodded, listening intently. What do you think caused your initial concern? Emily looked at Mark, her voice full of sincerity. I grew up in a society where I was taught that people with dark skin were a threat. I know that was wrong. I was blind to my own bias. And now I realize that this is just one example of how societal stereotypes can ruin lives. Against the backdrop of these revelations, the cameras began to pick up on the emotions of the viewers. People sitting behind the screens began to actively discuss what they had heard. Many expressed support, but some remained critical. "Tell me what you want to say to those who will be watching this," the interviewer asked, looking at both of them. Mark, collecting his thoughts, replied, "I want people to understand that fear should not drive our actions. Instead, we must be open to learning and understanding each other. We must be willing to re-examine our beliefs and change them." Emily added, "I want others to know that bias isn't just a personal issue, it's a societal issue that needs our attention. We can all change the way we perceive each other, and it starts with conversation." When the shoot was over, Emily and Mark felt relieved but also anxious. They knew their words could spark a new round of discussion, and they were prepared for the consequences. When they returned home, they saw the video of their interview begin to go viral. Social media exploded, people shared their story, and the comments kept coming. They were no longer just part of a news story, they were now a symbol of change. Over the next week, Emily and Mark became the faces of the anti-bias campaign. They attended events, spoke on panels, and each time they shared their story, they brought more attention to the issue of racial stereotyping. One day, after the event, a young woman with a child approached them. "I saw your interview," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "It gave me hope. I, too, have been guilty of bias, but now I understand that I need to learn and change." Emily felt tears welling up in her eyes. "Thank you for sharing your story," she replied. "Each of us can take a step toward change. This isn't just about us. This is about the future." Mark looked at Emily and saw her heart fill with hope. "You really did it," he said, and there was pride in his voice. "You showed that change is possible." Emily smiled, but there was still a little fear in her heart. "But this is not the end. We need to keep talking and acting so that our words matter." And indeed, with each speech, they saw more and more people joining their campaign. The conversation about bias continued to evolve, and they knew this was just the beginning. As Emily and Mark's story became more and more known, they began to notice that behind their backs, not only support was growing, but also hatred. People who had previously remained in the shadows began to speak out with criticism. In parallel with their story, opinions full of bias and hostility were surfacing on social media. One evening, as Emily was preparing dinner, her phone vibrated again, causing her to feel anxious. With each notification on her screen, she felt her heart beat faster. This time, it was a text from one of her acquaintances, who simply could not understand her actions. "You have put yourself to shame," he wrote. "How could you cast a shadow on your family? You have deceived yourself and now everyone can see what you really are." Emily felt the words like knives cutting into her soul. She knew she had done wrong, but she wanted people to understand that she was sincere in her desire to change. Her inner demons began to torment her again. "Maybe I was wrong after all," she thought, but soon decided not to give up. She dialed Mark's number. "I don't know how to handle this," she admitted, her voice agitated. "Some people just don't understand. They say I betrayed my family." "Don't let that discourage you," he replied, his voice firm. "You're doing important work. We have to keep talking about this. We can't let those who don't understand shut us up." However, outside their small world, new events were breaking out. The video, in which Emily and Mark became heroes and victims at the same time, was quickly gaining popularity. Unknown people began making memes that mocked them and escalated the situation. Many people tried to find ways to use their story for their own interests, including for political games. One day, as Emily was walking home after a long day, she was stopped by a crowd of protesters. They were chanting, "Emily, Emily, traitor." It was completely unexpected, and Emily felt panic rising inside her. She looked around and saw some of these people holding signs with offensive slogans. "How can you continue to talk about equality when you've allowed racial stereotypes to rule you?" one woman screamed, her voice furious. Emily paused, realizing that in that moment her inner world and outer conflict collided. She knew that this was not just a crowd, but a reflection of deep-rooted fears and prejudices in society, but it was also a challenge to her courage and determination. "I'm not a traitor," she said, her voice shaking but resilient. "I tried to learn and change. I wanted others to understand that bias isn't just words, it's a real threat to a lot of people. The crowd froze. Some of the protesters began to whisper, their gazes became more wary. Emily felt the oppressive atmosphere begin to change, but at the same time it did not disappear. "You never understand fear," she said, her voice loud and confident. "I knew it was dangerous to call the police, but fear for my family and my own biases drowned out my better judgment. I now realize it was a mistake, and I'm ready to correct it." However, at this point, arguments began to break out among the crowd. Some began to call for her support, while others were still opposed. Emily saw Mark step forward, his face reflecting determination and anger. "Emily is not the enemy," he said, his voice full of passion. "She is a person trying to learn. She did not commit a crime. She was only striving to be better. We all have to be open to change." Meanwhile, one of the protesters, clearly under the influence of emotion, shouted, "But you still called the police. You could have ruined his life." Emily felt her inner peace begin to crumble. "I understand that, and I'm so sorry, but let's talk about this instead of fueling hatred. We need conversations, not accusations." But instead of calming the crowd, her words only added fuel to the fire. Some began to make threats, while others shouted at her to leave the place. All the while, Emily felt the tension growing, and her heart pounded with fear. She knew that it wasn't just personal biases that stood in their way, but structural problems that were deeply rooted in society. "Emily, let's go," Mark said, his voice urgent. He knew that in this situation they could become targets for hatred. As they made their way through the crowd, Emily felt her fears being laid bare all along. She realized that she was not just facing society's hatred, but her own demons. There was a struggle going on inside her that she couldn't ignore. When they finally reached safety, Emily broke down. Tears rolled down her cheeks. "I don't know how to fix this," she said, her voice shaking with effort. "I've tried to do what's right, but it's all so hard." "You're doing the best you can," Mark replied, hugging her. "You're not alone. We're in this together, and while we have a long way to go, it's important that you're willing to move forward." The day after the violent events at the protests, Emily and Mark woke up with a heavy feeling. They had too many thoughts plaguing their minds. Emily looked out the window, watching the cars drive down the street, and wondered how she could have called the police. She knew that this decision had destroyed not only Mark's life, but also her own sense of herself. "Mark," she began, her voice barely audible, "I just can't shake the feeling that I broke something inside of me. I wanted to do the right thing, but how could I have gotten it so wrong?" Mark, sitting on the kitchen table, looked at her with understanding. "You didn't break yourself, Emily. We all make mistakes, but what matters is how we learn from them and how we can help others. You're already sharing your experiences, and that's important." Emily hugged him, but deep down she knew that this couldn't be the end. Their story had become an example for many, but it was still filled with contradictions and fears that would not simply disappear. That evening, as they were preparing for another interview, Emily noticed her daughter, Lily, approaching them with a worried expression on her face. "Mom, why are they saying bad things about you at school? I heard the kids talking about you and Mark. Why would anyone hate us?" Emily felt her heart clench in pain. She looked at Lily and realized that her own mistakes were affecting not only her, but her family as well. "Sweetie, some people just don't understand, and sometimes they act out of fear," she replied, trying to be as honest as possible. "I made a mistake, and now I have to do everything I can to fix it." Lily shook her head, her eyes shining with confusion. "But doesn't that mean we should help them understand, not hate?" Emily's words hit a nerve. "You're right, Lily. We have to keep talking, even if it's hard." After that conversation, she and Mark made a decision. Instead of hiding, they had to open up to people, to talk about their feelings and experiences, even if it was difficult. It was a challenge they were willing to take on. The next day, they organized a meeting with the local community. Emily and Mark invited people who were against their actions, as well as those who supported them. They knew it would be a difficult conversation, but they believed that honest dialogue could do more good than silence. When they arrived at the meeting, the atmosphere was tense. Some of those who had come looked at them with disdain, others with interest. Emily stood up first. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I understand that our actions have caused a lot of controversy. I am here to hear you and explain why I did what I did." Mark added, "I want you to know that we can all learn from our mistakes. I want this conversation to be the beginning of our understanding of each other." However, some of those present began shouting and asking provocative questions. "How could you call the police on a man who was just playing with a child?" one of the participants shouted. Emily felt the tension build. "I acted out of fear," she said, trying to remain calm. "My fear clouded my judgment. I know it was a mistake, and I'm willing to learn. But please, let's talk about this openly." The debate continued, but gradually the conversation began to take a more constructive turn. People began to share their own stories, and they understood that everyone faced biases and fears. It was a difficult but important discussion, and it became a way to create space for openness and honesty. After the meeting, Emily and Mark felt exhausted but determined. They knew it was just the beginning. However, at this point they realized they couldn't continue on their own and decided to seek professional help to work on their internal fears and biases. They began attending group sessions where they discussed their emotions, fears, and, most importantly, ways to overcome them. It was a difficult journey, and they often found it difficult to open up. But with each step, they began to understand that only through honest conversation and recognition of their shortcomings could they build a more just society. But as is usually the case, with every step toward progress came new challenges. Each of them experienced internal contradictions and fears that hindered their path. Emily increasingly faced the consequences of her actions, and this process of realization continued to leave deep scars on her heart. One day, when they returned home after class, they received a message that shook them to their core. The video of their interview with hateful comments began to spread on social media again, but now with new stickers and provocative memes. Emily glanced at her phone screen and felt her inner peace crumble once again. "Why can't they just leave us alone?" she asked, her voice shaking with emotion. "This is our reality," Mark replied, his face reflecting anger and pain. "But we can't let them break us. We have to keep fighting for what's right." This was just a prelude to what was to come, and Emily knew they had to be prepared for whatever was to come. Their story, full of scars and pain, was just beginning. Days after the shocking news, Emily and Mark were left dealing with the aftermath of the escalating situation. Emily was still reeling from the videos and negative comments that flooded her social media daily. Even as they tried to take steps to make things right, the world around them continued to fuel hatred and misunderstanding. One evening, as Emily was preparing dinner, her phone vibrated again. She glanced at the screen and saw a new notification. It was a message from her friend, who had also seen one of the videos circulating online. "Emily, have you seen what they are saying about you? It's horrible. Do you really think everything you did was right?" a friend wrote. Emily clutched the phone in her hands, feeling anger building inside her. "How could I become a target for hate? I was just trying to protect my family," she thought. Mark walked into the kitchen, noticing her gloomy expression. "What happened?" he asked, sitting down on the table. Emily showed him the message. "This keeps happening. I thought we could start an open dialogue, and instead all I get is hate," she said, her voice filled with despair. "Don't let them break you," Mark said. "We can still influence people, and they will understand us. The main thing is not to give up." But Emily felt like their efforts were being met with a wall. That evening, they decided to go for a walk to clear their heads. As they stepped outside, the quiet of the evening was broken by noise coming from the next block. As it turned out, a crowd was gathering there. Loud shouts and whispers alerted Emily and Mark. "Let's go see what's going on," he suggested. They came closer and saw that people had gathered to protest against Emily. "Look at this traitor," one of the men shouted, holding a sign with her picture on it, with the phrase, "Wrong choice, wrong sacrifice," written on it. Emily felt her heart skip a beat. "Oh no, it's worse," she whispered. "Pull yourself together, Emily," Mark said, hugging her. "We need to talk to them. They need to know we're here, and that we're not alone." As they got closer, the crowd began to notice them. Some started shouting, pointing at Emily. "It's her," she called the police. Emily steeled herself and stepped in front of Mark. "I'm here to talk," she said, trying to sound confident despite the trepidation inside. "I understand your anger, and I'm here to take responsibility for my actions." The crowd froze for a moment, but then someone shouted, "How can you talk about what you did? You ruined a man's life." Emily felt shame wash over her. "I know it was a mistake. I let my fear get the better of me, and I know it's wrong, but let's talk about it instead of just hating each other." Conflicting opinions began to emerge among the crowd. "She doesn't deserve our attention," one woman screamed. But others began to raise their voices in Emily's defense. But she admitted her mistake. That's the first step. The tension in the air was growing palpable. Emily glanced at Mark, and she saw the support in his eyes. "We're all here to learn from each other," he said. "Emily isn't perfect, but she's trying to be better, and that's something." Some protesters began to respond to his words, but not everyone was ready for dialogue. It was a tense moment, and Emily realized they had to be brave. "I know that bias and fear can blind people," she said. "I've been a victim of that myself, but unless we start talking openly about our fears and worries, nothing will change." As if on cue, some began to shout in displeasure, but Emily continued. "I don't apologize for being human. I apologize for my fears. I apologize for letting those fears control me." This sincerity began to ease the tension a little, but hatred was still in the air. Not everyone was ready to hear her words. "Not everyone is ready to accept this lesson," she whispered, and at that moment the understanding of her situation became even clearer. Despite everything that was happening, Emily felt like they were on the edge of something important. Their struggle with prejudice and fear was far from over, but they were willing to move forward, even if it meant facing hatred. As they left the protest, Emily knew it would be a long road to recovery and they still had a lot of work to do, but she was determined to keep going. A flame of hope lit in her heart, hope that they could make a difference, even if the road was difficult. Despite everything that had happened, Emily couldn't forget Mark. She knew that her actions had seriously affected his life, and she felt compelled to apologize. It was important not only for her conscience, but also for her desire to understand how her fears and biases had affected others. She began looking for ways to contact Mark. Over the next few days, she tried various approaches, sending messages, leaving comments on his social media, even asking mutual friends if they knew how to contact him. She knew time was running out, but her resolve only grew stronger. Finally, she found Mark's phone number. Emily took a deep breath and pressed the call button. Her heart was pounding like it was going to jump out of her chest, but she knew she had to do it. The phone rang, and after a few long rings, she heard Mark's voice. "Hello," he replied, his voice tense. "Mark, it's Emily," she began, trying to speak calmly. "I know you don't want to hear me, but I just want to apologize. I know I made a mistake, and I'm really sorry I called the police." Mark was silent for a few seconds, and Emily felt her heart squeeze again. "Emily, you understand what happened, and it's important, but I don't know what you want from me." "I want to talk," she admitted. "I want to understand how you feel. I don't want my fears to tear us apart. I'm willing to learn from my mistakes, and I hope you can give me a chance." Mark sighed. "It's not easy. I can't just forget about what happened. I never expected that the person who lives next door could call the police on me when I was just spending time with my child." Emily felt tears welling up in her eyes. "I understand, and I can't justify my actions. I was driven by fear and prejudice. I want you to know that I'm sorry for it." "Why did you even call?" Mark asked, his voice softening. "It wasn't just a misunderstanding. It changed my life. I don't know how to explain it," Emily said, "but I want to correct my mistakes. I want to help others understand how it works. I want my children to grow up in a world where they're not afraid of people who are different from them." After a pause, Mark continued, "I'm ready to talk, but I'm not sure I can forgive you right now. It takes time. I'm willing to wait," Emily said, feeling a small spark of hope ignite inside her. "I just want to do this right." They agreed to meet the following week, and Emily couldn't contain her excitement. This meeting could be a turning point for both of them, and she was ready to open up, listen, and learn. Over the next week, Emily immersed herself in learning about bias and race. She read books, watched documentaries, and even began attending local racial consciousness workshops. Emily sought to understand not only her mistakes, but also the roots of her fears and prejudices. When the day came to meet Mark, Emily felt her heart pounding in her chest. She chose a quiet cafe where they could talk in peace. The anticipation was tense, but she knew she had to keep an open mind. When Mark entered the cafe, he looked a little wary. Emily stood up to greet him. "Hi, thanks for coming," she said, trying to sound confident. "Hello," he replied, his face serious. They sat down at the table, and the atmosphere was tense. Emily looked into his eyes and felt that now was the time to open up. "I know I hurt you, and I'm here to listen," she began. I want to understand how you feel. Mark looked at her with disbelief, but then exhaled. It was humiliating and painful. I never thought I could face such prejudice from someone who lives next door. Emily nodded, feeling tears welling up in her eyes. I understand, and this is not justifiable. I've let my fears cloud my judgment. I don't know how to fix this, but I'm willing to listen. Mark was silent for a moment, and they both felt that this could be a turning point in their relationship. I can't just forgive and forget, but I'm willing to talk, he said, and there was a hint of hope in his voice. Emily knew this was just the beginning of a long journey. They began to exchange thoughts and feelings, and gradually an atmosphere of trust grew between them. The conversation became deeper and more meaningful, and Emily realized that this was exactly what she needed. Every word, every confession brought them closer to understanding each other. Emily felt that with each passing moment, she was not only beginning to correct her mistakes, but also opening herself up to understanding the other. It was a process full of pain and confusion, but she was willing to go through it to learn how to be the best version of herself. By the end of their meeting, Emily felt like this conversation was the beginning of something bigger, and they were both willing to take responsibility for their actions and learn from each other. This was a journey toward reconciling with the past, and while there were still many challenges ahead, Emily knew they were moving in the right direction. Several months have passed since Emily met Mark. During this time, she has not only changed her perception of the world around her, but also become an active supporter of equality. Emily realized that her mistake was not just a lesson, but the beginning of a new chapter in her life. She began to actively engage in local communities, promoting ideas of equality and justice. Emily attended meetings organized by various groups that sought to break the chains of bias and create a more inclusive society. She learned about the real problems that many people face and realized how important every voice is in the fight for change. Emily volunteered her time each week. She worked at a homeless shelter, where she met people from all walks of life. These encounters opened her eyes to the real stories of people who found themselves in difficult life situations. Their suffering and hope inspired Emily to share her experiences, opening up about her own fears and biases. One day, during a volunteer session, she met a woman named Laura, who shared her story of being a victim of bias. I can't believe that in the 21st century we still have these kinds of stereotypes, Laura said, her voice shaking with emotion. Many people don't even realize how painful it is. Emily, remembering her earlier fears, thought deeply, I didn't realize it either. I thought I was doing the right thing, when in fact it was a terrible mistake, she admitted, feeling the desire to do something meaningful grow inside her. Laura nodded in understanding. But now you know, and that's a step forward. We're all learning. It's important that you use your voice to make a change. Emily began actively sharing her thoughts and stories on social media. She posted articles and videos explaining how bias can ruin lives and how important it is to fight it. Starting with yourself, her posts went viral, and many responded by sharing their own stories. She even organized a series of local workshops, inviting speakers willing to discuss racial and social issues. These events attracted local attention, and Emily felt a dialogue beginning to emerge in her community. At the same time, Emily continued to stay in touch with Mark. He became her friend and mentor. Their conversations about race and bias inspired her to continue her work. Mark shared his experiences, which gave her insight into how her own fears could cloud reality. One day, they decided to attend a local equality rally together. Emily stood next to Mark, feeling a fire of determination burning in her heart. They held a sign that read, "Equality for all, open your hearts." As they walked down the street among the crowd, Emily felt her heart fill with pride. People shouted slogans as they passed, and the atmosphere was filled with hope. Emily understood that this wasn't just her fight, but the fight of everyone who had ever felt left out or misunderstood. At the end of the rally, when silence fell, she raised her voice to share her story. I want to talk about my fear and how it broke me. I was not perfect, and I made mistakes, but I am here to learn and change. We can all take steps towards a better society. The crowd cheered her on. It was so important to her and she knew her voice mattered. Emily realized that her mistake had opened the door to new opportunities, and it made her stronger. She was willing to continue to fight bias and work to change the world for the better, even if it took time and effort. Now, as Emily looked to the future, she saw it not as a source of fear, but as a chance for change. This was a new chapter in her life, full of hope and a desire for justice. Emily was ready to move forward. knowing that every step mattered, and together with Mark and others, they could make the world a better place for everyone.